Good evening and welcome here to 5 by 15. It's great to see so many of you joining us tonight, and it has indeed been quite a day. We don't always get a new Prime Minister, but I have to say, when I was watching the quote coronation of Liz Truss at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, it sort of seemed like it was only yesterday that we were having a go with another Prime Minister. However, wait to be seen what will happen. And as I don't know about you, but I can't think of a better way to spend the next hour not having to listen to Liz Truss talk about pledges about, well, the energy crisis and this and that and the other. Let's go somewhere completely different. And that somewhere is to a small town in Germany called Jena, which at a particular period in history was literally the center of critical thought, of romanticism, of understanding of the self. Ideas were formed in this small town that went on to shape how all of us think and how literature and how so much of our modern discourse has ensued. Indeed, it would probably be a very, very good idea for the new Prime Minister if she was watching tonight, because it's a real understanding of the dilemma between narcissism and various kinds of self-interest. I'm thrilled to be welcoming Andrea Wulf back to 5 by 15. Andrea was the author of the extraordinary book about Alexander von Humboldt, which won every award going, and she's here tonight with her book The Magnificent Rebels, which is the story of this community in Jena. Andrea is a fantastic writer. The reviews of this book have been extraordinary. I particularly liked the one that said she makes the learning so light, but when you get to the back and you see the kind of work she's done to bring you just those key bits of information, you know this is a work of serious, serious scholarship. Joining her is Kirsty Lang, who is the well-known presenter of Front Row, and in fact is now the first female host of the fiendishly difficult Round Britain quiz. So I have absolutely no qualms about handing Andrea into the arms, or the metaphorical arms, since Kirsty's in Vienna and Andrea is in London, the long distance arms of Kirsty for the next hour. The format is the same as usual. They'll be talking for about 45 minutes. I'm sure that you will all have lots of questions, and Andrea's well up to answering them, even the very philosophical ones. So please put them in the Q&A and please buy the book. The details will be in the chat. Now it's over to Kirsty, and enjoy yourselves. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you, Rosie. I'm going to start by setting the scene a little bit for this book. Every so often in history, you get situations where a group of incredibly talented and unconventional individuals congregate in a particular place at a particular time and create this extraordinary flowering of creativity. So I'm thinking of Paris in the 1920s, for instance, where you had Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, Schlegel, Picasso, Josephine Baker, all those jazz musicians, etc. And then, of course, in London, the Bloomsbury set. And Andrea Wulf's book is about just such a group. Her marvelous rebels are poets, they're playwrights, they're philosophers, they're scientists, they include Goethe, Schiller, Hegel, Alexander von Humboldt, and they congregated roughly between 1794 and 1806, as Rosie said, in the small German university town of Jena, and they fomented a revolution of the mind. Wulf argues that their radical ideas about self, about free will, about freedom of expression still shape the way we live now. They were the first romantics, and their ideas were spread to Britain through Wordsworth and Coleridge. And Andrea has called them the Jena set, a bit like the free-spirited Bloomsbury set. Because there are quite a few parallels, which we're going to discuss. They lived in each other's pockets. They were friends. They slept with each other. They frequently fell out with each other. So their relationships were intense, both intellectually and emotionally. Andrea spent 5 years, including much of lockdown, ploughing through archives, reading their letters. Fortunately, they wrote loads of letters, diaries, pamphlets, and books, weaving this moment together when all these brilliant people were in Jena, and she's woven it together in a really compelling narrative. It is a fabulous book. Congratulations, Andrea. Why don't we start with the genesis of this, of Marvelous Rebels? I mean, how did you come up with the idea?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the lovely introduction. You kind of summarized the book in a, I really need to learn this kind of elevator pitch too. I have failed to do that so far. So so I kind of almost fell into this story when I was doing the research for my previous book about Alexander von Humboldt, because Humboldt had spent many, many months in Jena visiting his brother who lived there. So as I was doing the research in Jena and I was walking through the streets and, you know, looking around, I saw all these name plaques on the houses with the names of the people who had lived there. And it was, I just couldn't believe my eyes, because it was literally the who's who of Germany's thinkers and poets and philosophers. And though some of these names, or quite a few of these names, might not be very well known to the English speaking world, they are really the superstars of German literature and philosophy. So let me just very briefly kind of say who was actually there. So there was, as you said, there was Goethe, who was Germany's most famous poet. There was the playwright Friedrich Schiller, who'd become famous through the play, his revolutionary play, The Robbers, and who liked to write with rotten apples in the drawer of his desk. There was the young poet Novalis, who played with death and darkness, and who died at the age of 28, and frozen in time and youth, he became really the epitome of the young romantic. And some of you might have heard about him through Penelope Fitzgerald's beautiful novel, The Blue Flower. There were a bunch of philosophers, the philosopher Fichte, who put the self at center stage. There was Friedrich Schelling, who redefined our relationship with nature, and then Hegel, who would become one of the most famous philosophers of the Western world. There were a couple of brothers, pairs of brothers. There were the Schlegel brothers, Friedrich and August Wilhelm, who were both literary critics and writers. And then there were the Humboldt brothers, the older one, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was the founder, later the founder of the first university in Berlin, and then Alexander von Humboldt, who would become the most famous scientist of our time. And then there were a couple of quite extraordinary women, and we're going to talk a little bit more, hopefully, about them later. But one of them was August Wilhelm's wife, Caroline Schlegel. And each of these great intellects lived a life worth telling. But what's even more extraordinary is that they all, so more than just their individual stories, is that they all came together in this tiny little town at exactly the same time. So I wanted to find out why did they all come together, and found this extraordinary story of radical ideas about the creative power of the self and the true meaning of freedom. So they really changed the way we think about the world. And I'm interested.
Before we get onto that, I just wanted to, because you posed that question, why Jena? I mean, what were the special social and political circumstances that allowed this pretty small town? I mean, you say in the book, it kind of takes about 5 minutes to cross the whole place. What allowed it to become this center for free expression when, much, elsewhere in Europe, there's censorship, there's authoritarian governments? Why here?
So let me start actually with Germany, just to set the scene a little bit. So Germany at the end of the 18th century was not a unified nation. It was a patchwork of 1,500 states, ranging from tiny principalities to powerful states such as Austria and Prussia. And Jena was in the small duchy of Saxe-Weimar, which was pretty much in the center of what was then called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, one advantage, or unintended advantage of this fragmentation was that censorship was very difficult to enforce in this kind of, jigsaw of states, because each state had their own set of rules. So very different to more centrally ruled states such as England or France. England, France, and Spain also had powerful monarchies with a global reach through their colonies. America had its unexplored west, but in Germany, everything was kind of inward looking and splintered. So the German imagination was really fed through words and books, and Germans were fanatical readers. Everybody was reading. The book market was 4 to 5 times bigger than the English book market. Literacy rates soared. So Saxony and Prussia were actually leading the world at the end of the 18th century. So, and there were around 50 universities compared to 2 in England. So arguments, ideas traveled very, very easily in Germany. So that's the kind of, I think, the framework of this. And then the question is, of course, why Jena? Because Jena is, as you said, was a very small town, 4,500 inhabitants. It took less than 10 minutes to cross. It was a university town. So it was very much dominated by its university, by its almost 900 students. So out of the 4,500, 900 were students. It was a bustling town. It kind of had still a medieval feel. There was an open market space, cobblestones. There were plenty of taverns, bookbinders, a university with 50,000 books. And it was a town that attracted more liberally minded thinkers and writers than any other town in Germany. And so everybody who had problems with their authorities in their home states would arrive in Jena. And the reason for that was, well, one reason was that it was ruled by a quite enlightened ruler who kind of encouraged a certain openness and frankness. But the real reason was the university, or the governance of the university, because the university had once belonged to Saxony, but then through complicated inheritance laws, it was nominally ruled by 4 different Saxon dukes with no one really in charge. So it meant that professors could basically teach here what they wanted. So it became this place that attracted people who had, revolutionary ideas. The more of those arrived, the more they attracted it. So it becomes this, yeah.
Yeah. So that brings me to my next question. So that's the place, and you've got this unique set of circumstances, lack of censorship and so on, and the university. What about the timing? Because it's just after the French Revolution, isn't it? How important is that to the Jena set?
Well, the French Revolution is hugely important. So the Jena set story really begins in 1794. So that's 5 years after the French Revolution. But I think in order to understand just how important the French Revolution is, we need to understand what happened actually before. So the Jena set, the members of the Jena set were born into a world that was completely different to ours. It was ruled by monarchs that decided pretty much every detail of their subjects' life. So they could refuse permission to get married. They could decide the professions of their subjects. Some could sell their subjects as mercenaries to other nations. The feudal system was still there in some parts of Europe. So it was a world that was really ruled by despotism, inequality, and control. And then the French Revolution happened in 1789, and it was an event that was so dramatic and pivotal that hardly anyone in Europe was unaffected by it. And what the French revolutionaries did is they declared all men to be equal. And when they did that, they promised a new social order that was based on the idea of, the power of freedom. So, and the power of ideas. So this is the moment, really, I think, where philosophy leaves the kind of ivory tower of rarefied thought and arrives in the minds of ordinary people. So the French revolutionaries, or the French Revolution, proved that ideas are more powerful than weapons or the might of kings and queens. So everybody was watching France, how the idea of a state emerged into a real state. And the French revolutionaries really changed the political landscape of Europe, but the Jena set incited the revolution of the mind that we still feel today. So yes, so the French Revolution was incredibly important.
So that's the timing, that's the place. Let's go back to the people. I think the most famous of the Jena set must be Goethe in both British and German terms. Explain to us why he's so important, and also the role he plays in the group, because he's a bit older than the rest of them. He's this rather congenial father figure who oversees this group of unruly, excitable youngsters. But why is he so important?
Well, he was really Germany's most celebrated poet. And he actually didn't live in Jena, he lived in nearby Weimar, which was about 15 miles away, but he spent many, many months every year in Jena. So that's why I'm kind of counting him into the Jena set. He became an international literary superstar in the 1770s with his novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, and which was a novel about a kind of forlorn lover who commits suicide, and it inspired a whole generation. It was the so-called Storm and Stress era, and it was a novel that really encouraged this idea that feelings, or that set feelings against the rationalism of the Enlightenment. So Werther, The Sorrows of the Young Werther, was so popular that there was a Werther fever, young men dressed in a Werther uniform. People said that many men, that kind of started a wave of suicides. Lord Byron later, 40 years later, joked to Goethe that his Werther had killed more people, more young men than the Napoleonic Wars. So he was really, really huge, basically. But by 1794, he was not the kind of dashing young Apollo of his youth anymore. He was in his mid-40s, not very old for us, but then he was kind of the grand old man. And he had also become part of the duchy's administration. So he's the privy councillor of the Duke. He was in charge of the court theatre and the mines of the duchy's mines, and he was pretty depressed in the mid-1790s because of the French Revolutionary Wars, and he found solace in the sciences. So he became obsessed with botany, comparative anatomy. He was in charge of kind of building a botanical garden in Jena. So he's kind of like basically hiding inside the sciences. And then in 1794, he met Friedrich Schiller, who was the playwright. And it was the beginning of one of the most fruitful literary friendships in German history. And because both of them had problems writing. I mean, Goethe had not produced anything remarkable for years. So they kind of came together and they inspired each other and they challenged each other and they edited each other's work. So that's the kind of framework. And then this kind of gaggle of young, rebellious kind of thinkers and arrives. And he is older, more famous, so he takes on this role of almost like a benevolent godfather who, whenever they are in trouble, he tries to mediate and help out, and because they squabble a lot. But at the same time, their new and radical ideas very much kind of invigorate him. So he's breathing in their youth. And he just begin, and he really, this is like the beginning of one of the most productive phases of his life. And they in turn worship him, and they put him on a pedestal and call him their kind of demigod. So it's a quite well-functioning relationship, basically, between that younger group and the older kind of Goethe.
Now, I have to confess, my favorite character in this group is this extraordinary woman, Carolina. She's the sort of person you read about and you kind of wish she was still alive so you could hang out with her. Tell us about her.
Yeah, she's also, she's definitely one of my favorites too. So let me introduce her properly, because her name is Caroline Michaelis Böhme Schelling. Oh my God, let me say that again. Caroline Michaelis Böhme Schelling. So she carried the name of her father and her 3 husbands. So, but at the same time, she refused to be restricted by the role that society had intended for women at that time. And she really stands at the heart of the Jena set. She was not just their muse. She really was a kind of a very important member of the Jena set. She was born in 1763. She was the daughter of a famous German scholar. She was raised on a diet of literature, poetry, and politics. She was beautiful, she was witty, she was educated, clever, and she was fiercely independently minded. She married young. She was widowed by the age of 24. She then hung out with German revolutionaries, only to be imprisoned by the Prussians for being a sympathizer with the French Revolution. in prison, so not only that, in prison, she discovered that she was pregnant after a one-night stand with an 18-year-old French soldier. So quite something.
As you do.
Quite something at a time when it was scandalous behavior to just be on your own with a man in a room. So then the young writer, but she was not deterred actually by this. She said that, why should her life be destroyed by one little foolishness? A mistake that would have meant nothing had she been a man. So she has this very fierce sense of, we're equal, back then. Then the writer, August Wilhelm Schlegel, comes really to rescue her. He marries her, gives her a new name, which is really, for her a new beginning, and then takes her to Jena in 1796, where she becomes the heart of the Jena set. So she creates the physical space they meet in, they work together and stuff like that. But she's a razor sharp critic who dissects poets and plays and essays with kind of deep knowledge. Her husband begins to rely on her literary mind. She takes on the role as the editor of their literary magazine. She writes reviews under her husband's name, and together with her husband, she translates 16 Shakespeare plays, which are to this day the standard edition in Germany. And not only that, and I quite like this idea that his work on Shakespeare, he publishes some lectures on Shakespeare, which are very much informed by his discussion with her, resurrect Shakespeare in England. So because in the 18th century, Shakespeare had become quite unpopular. His language was seen as being vulgar and ordinary and ungrammatical. Voltaire, for example, had called Hamlet a work of a drunken savage. So then he writes this book, which all the young romantics in England read. So William Wordsworth, for example, says that it was we needed a German critic to teach us correctly about Shakespeare.
I think you've got a great quote in your book, or maybe it's a line from you where you talk about Carolina's role, and you say if the Jena set was an orchestra, she was the conductor, the hostess, the editor of the magazine, the co-translator of Shakespeare, and so on. But I want to get into their relationships with each other, because Friedrich Schlegel, her brother-in-law, wrote in one of his letters, "We're all part of the same family of magnificent outlaws." And it's interesting that he uses this word family, because their relationships with each other were intense, weren't they?
Yes, so they really, I think they were a family of outlaws in this respect. So there's two sides to this. One is that they worked together. So first of all, actually, Friedrich Schelling, all these people are called Friedrich in a name with it's very confusing. You have the Schlegel brothers, Caroline, and Friedrich Schlegel's lover, the divorced writer Dorothea Veit. They live together. So this is in their house in Jena. So this is almost like the first commune in Germany. But they also work together, and the people who don't live in the house come over during the day. They work together. They have lunches. So Caroline is, as you said, really like she's entertaining the guests, but she's also very much kind of steering the discussions. And they write together, they work together, and they love this kind of communal way of working. It's very, very important for them. The novelist says at some stage, I produce best in dialogue. So it's the working together that is very important for them. And then, this book is really, it's a book about big ideas like the beginning of the modern South, but at the same time, it's also a bit of a soap opera, because they are, and there's so much kind of scandals and sex in this book. There are passionate love affairs, there are open marriages, there are children born out of wedlock. Like Friedrich Schlegel, for example, lives together with Dorothea Veit, who's divorced. They're not married, but he also has other lovers on the side. Then, as if that wasn't scandalous enough, he publishes a autobiographical erotic novel in which he invites the readers to his bedroom, watching him and Dorothea make love in very, very explicit detail. Or you have, you have diary pages where you can see what's going on. So Novalis, for example, he doggedly records his sexual urges and his masturbation in his diary. I mean, it literally goes like every day, like lewd fantasy in the morning, more lewdness in the afternoon. And then, you have something like lewd fantasy in the morning leads to an explosion in the afternoon. You have Wilhelm von Humboldt, who he records like visits to prostitutes as like an accountant. In return, his wife's lover lives with the Humboldts in their house in Jena, very openly taking part in their social activities. Goethe is living together with his mistress, who's the mother of his son, also not married. So and then you have Caroline, who was pregnant, who gave birth after the pregnancy with a young soldier, then marries August Wilhelm. Friedrich Schlegel is also in love with her, but then she takes the young Schelling as her lover, and her husband doesn't mind at all because he has affairs. So, and he kind of jokes about it and says, well, because he's 12 years younger, Schelling, to Caroline. In time, she'll move on to even younger men who are still running around in a little sailor suit. So it's such a mess. And no one knows who's sleeping with him, with whom. That one friend said the Schlegel household is the kind of big pigsty. So there's a lot of fun there also. But I think they're a family of outlaws, definitely.
I think what's so impressive about this book, Andrea, is that you managed to interweave this fabulous soap opera with some incredibly complex philosophical ideas, which you explain in layman's terms. For instance, the ideas of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, this young professor of philosophy at Jena University, who comes up with the philosophy of the self. Can you unpack that for us and tell us a little bit more about Fichte?
Yeah, so Fichte is quite a character. So he arrives in 1794 in Jena. He's a professor of philosophy at the university there. He gives his lectures dressed in riding boots with spurs and kind of whip in hand, and he is feared for his volatile temper. So there's nothing gentle about him. He thunders and shouts. He stomps rather than walks. He eats his snuff tobacco rather than inhaling it. And he's so popular that his lectures are so full that some of the students have to stand outside the windows, like on ladders, to kind of see something. And what he does is, so they call him the Bonaparte of philosophy, because he really revolutionized our way of thinking about us. And so at a time when most of Europe is held in the iron fist of absolutism, he gives the self the most thrilling of all powers, which is free will and self-determination. And he says there are no God-given or absolute truth. The only certainty there is that the world is experienced by the self. Now, that might not sound so exciting to us because we're so used to understanding the world through the prism of our mind, through the prism of ourself. But for centuries, philosophers and thinkers had said that the world was ruled by a divine hand. And, mathematics and rational observation might have paved, the path to knowledge, so we can understand, say, natural laws, but we couldn't shape them. So we remained these kind of human cogs in this seemingly divinely ordained machine. So humans were certainly not free. So when Fichte said, the source of all reality is the self, it was an explosive idea. And he said, the self posits itself, which means the self basically brings itself into existence. Not only that, he also said that through this initial powerful act, the self also brings the external world into existence, at least in our mind. So he didn't mean that we create the world, but ourself creates the knowledge of the world. And that was a radically new idea, because it basically meant that the self was the agent of everything. The self was free. So this is the moment where he basically explained that the self ruled the world, not gods or kings and queens. And this is the beginning of the modern self.
Yeah. Which is, a pretty incendiary idea, isn't it? When you live in an age of absolute power and divine right of kings and so on. So then we have Jena as the birthplace of self-consciousness, self-obsession, selfishness. I mean, to what extent are we still living with the legacy of those ideas, do you think?
We still very much, I mean, we are a pretty selfish society, we are kind of obsessed with the self. I mean, there's a whole generation called the me generation, and self-fulfillment has become the mantra. So their ideas and their they tiptoe between selfishness and free will, and we do exactly the same balancing act still today. So we are, that is the beginning of how we are thinking today. Is really that moment in Jena, and it's it's a short moment. It's 10 years, so it's a kind of blink in the kind of great Western philosophy, but it's a very, very important moment.
Now, we associate the Romantics with Wordsworth, Coleridge, the Shelleys, Byron, Keats, but the term Romantic is first used in Jena. I mean, where does it come from? What does it mean in their terms, in the Jena set's terms?
So it's actually quite difficult to explain what it means, because they're quite like the unwieldiness of its undefinability. But it is, I think, very important to remember that the English Romantics were not the first Romantics. So the Jena set are really the first Romantics. They first use the word romantic in its new literary meaning, and they launched Romanticism as a international movement. So they give it its name and purpose, but also its intellectual freedom. So they're the first Romantics, but not the kind of dreamy, brooding kind of lovelorn type. So I think, a lot of people would associate with Romanticism kind of images of lone figures in a moonlit forest, or poems about forlorn lovers. Many say the Romantics have turned against reason. Others simply, when they hear the word romantic, think about candlelit dinner and passionate declarations of love. None of that was what the Jena set thought. So they believed that Romanticism was something much more complex and radical. And they basically said that Romanticism or romantic poetry was unruly, unwieldy, dynamic, alive. They called it was a living organism. And at the center of all of this stood poetry, but not in the way we understand it today, but in the old ancient Greek meaning, which means productive and creative. So romantic poetry for them could be a poem, but it could also be a novel, it could be a painting, it could be a piece of music, it could be a scientific experiment. So what they said is romantic poetry transcends disciplines. So just as two elements could create a new chemical compound, they believed that romantic poetry could bring together different disciplines and create something distinctively new. So they wanted to unite humankind and nature. They wanted to unite the arts and the sciences. So they said, we want to romanticize the whole world. And Novalis said at some stage, we have to poeticize the sciences. Friedrich Schlegel said, I want to make Euclid singable. So you wanted to kind of turn math and physics into music. So that became very, very important for them. But it's probably difficult to explain.
It's probably useful actually to bring in Schelling at this point, because he expands this idea of the unity between the self and nature, doesn't he? Placing humans firmly within nature, arguing that everything is interconnected. And I quote, from the frogs to the trees, to the stones, to the insects, and rivers to humans, we are all linked together, forming this one universal organism. It sort of reminded me a bit of James Lovelock, actually, and that sort of. And this, I mean, this has a big impact, doesn't it, on the way the English romantics, you know, all those kind of walking through nature, writing poetry about nature thought.
Yeah, so Schelling is very important. So he was 23 when he became professor of philosophy. I mean, he's done everything very young, and he basically said there's a secret bond between the self and nature, and he said that everything is linked together, as he said, forming one universal organism. So the living and the non-living world, he says, are ruled by the same underlying principles, and the self and nature is identical. And because that's what he believed, it then became, so that if you take it to its conclusion, it means that if we are identical with nature, it means that if we walk through nature, scrambling up a kind of hill or walking through a forest, it's always a self-discovery. And this philosophy of oneness then becomes the heartbeat of Romanticism, which it becomes incredibly important for Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who travels, for example, to Germany in 1798 to meet his heroes and to learn German. And he kind of, annoyingly for a historian, runs out of money, so he never makes it to Jena. But he's so obsessed with their works that he, for example, takes Schelling's work, translates pages and pages and pages, and just passes them on as his own work. So when Coleridge publishes his own his literary autobiography, Biographica Literaria, he gets accused by Thomas de Quincey, actually, that, you know, this is like barefaced plagiarism. And all of what Schelling is doing is very much kind of turning against what is pretty much the opposite of what Enlightenment thinkers had been saying. So they had, you know, celebrated rational observation, experiments, and rational thoughts. So scientists are kind of peered through microscopes to understand the minutiae of life. They have kind of lifted their telescopes to the skies to understand our place in the universe. And this increasingly kind of rational approach to nature had created a certain distance to nature, because nature was something that was meant to be observed through a kind of rational, objective perspective. And that was something the Jena said very much turned against, and said, you know, the world has become this gigantic mill wheel that just grounds itself to dust, and they wanted to inject imagination and emotions back into it.
Now, I want to ask you about your process, because I think people always find this really interesting. Clearly, you did a huge amount of research. You can see that from the footnotes of the book. They all wrote letters all the time. Was that your most important source, and where do you find these letters?
Yeah, they were definitely, I mean, there are 10,000s and thousands of letters, and they're beautiful letters because they're all writers and poets. So it's actually really fun to read these letters. So they are, and because these are big German names, they are very academic kind of letter editions where you have like 15 volumes of, or more even, I think 30 volumes of Goethe's letter, for example. So they are the kind of the skeleton of the research, because I think, especially with a bunch of people who have, you know, used the philosophy of the self as their, you know, that's how they understand the world. You can't look at their work without their life, because their lives become platforms to try out this new philosophy of the self, and their individual experience becomes their guiding light in their work, but also in their life. So the letters are incredibly important. And what I've also found is that, I mean, some of their works are really, I mean, some of the philosophy is hard to read, but in their letters, when they explain it to each other, it's often easier to understand, and you can also watch them kind of develop their ideas and how they kind of construct, you know, how they argue with each other and how their ideas kind of come from that. So I think that the letters are very, very important.
And of course, you've got loads of stuff about their sort of daily lives, which I love, you know, what they eat, what they wear, you know, the walks they go on, the art galleries they go to, etc., etc. I mean, what was it that struck you about the way they lived then compared to the way we live now?
Well, I tell you what I find just extraordinary is just how much work they did, but how much fun they all, I mean, they played hard and they worked hard. And then they had, and I mean, just what they produced, what they read, and then they still had like time to go for long walks and have like long dinners. So you kind of realize how much we are distracted by, you know, urban life, for example, or the internet and all these things, that they could just focus on what they were doing. And so that, for me, I think that was the where you realize it's just such a different world.
They didn't have all the distractions that we do.
No.
Yeah.
And they, you know, their attention span is, you know, the kind of depth they kind of dive into subjects again and again. You know, what is art, what is poetry, what is science, what's romantic poetry, again and again and again, you know, while we just kind of glance over a headline and then kind of move on to the next subject.
Yeah, you have this lovely passage where they all they have a sort of group of them go to Dresden, where there are these amazing art collections actually to this day, because the Grand Duke of that particular state was a big art collector, and they spend hours walking noisily through the galleries, standing in front of a painting for, you know, a long time, each painting, and they go back again and again, even at night time. And
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, so that's one of their summer vacations, you know, weeks and weeks on end, and they just go through the galleries with torches at night. And Carolina actually writes about this, a very long essay in one of in their literary magazine. So yes, they do stuff together all the time. It's really, I mean, they use the word sim, there's the prefix sim, and added to a lot of words, so like sim philosophizing, sim poetry, and sim basically meant together. And for them it meant, so they called it, you know, they called their literary magazine was their first symphony. So, you know, it means for them, you know, they really believe that two minds can produce something better than one mind.
I'm going to move to questions in a second, but I mean, just finally, what is the resonance of their story today? Would you say? Well,
for me, I would have not written this book if I'd not thought that they have a huge impact, because I'm interested in history, you know, not because it's history, but because I want to know why we are who we are. And so at the heart of the Magnificent Rebels is really this tension between the breathtaking possibilities of free will and the pitfalls of selfishness. And I think we are still empowered by their kind of daring leap into the self, but the self has stayed at center stage for the better or the worse. And I think that underpinning everything are two essential questions. Who am I as an individual, and who am I as a member of a society? So how can I live a meaningful life and still pursue my dreams, but still be a morally good person? How can I reconcile my personal liberty with the demands of a society? And I think the pandemic is a great example for that. You know, millions of us gave up our basic rights just for, you know, because we believed that this was the right thing for the greater good, but some of us didn't, and they insisted that their personal liberty was more important. But so from the moment that Fichte put the self at the nexus of his philosophy, we had to deal with the kind of perils of this emboldened self. But I think, you know, I mean, he never intended a narcissistic kind of celebration of the self, because what he always said is that freedom is tightly interwoven with moral obligations. So freedom gives us the choice on how to act and behave. It kind of elevates us over our base instincts, and freedom always comes with its twin, which is moral duty. So I think when, you know, we think today that we are free to think, that we are, you know, free to shape our opinions, control our lives, but I think recently it's become very, very clear that this very core of our society is under threat, be it through Russia's cyber interference in democratic societies, be it through fake news and social media, or more recently in the US, the overruling of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court. So I think right now, where all of this is so under threat, I think it is quite important to go back and remind ourselves, where does this modern self come from? Where does our hard-won self-determination come from? And how much are we going to fight for this, at a time when our democracies are hollowed out by liars and by despots? So I think they are incredibly important, their story, and very, very relevant today.
One question we've got is there's a feminist saying that the personal is political. Would that be true of the Magnificent Rebels?
I think so, yeah. I think so, very much so. I think, Fichte's philosophy is very much going to build on the spark of the French Revolution. They want to change. I mean, they liberated the self with the intention of creating a better society. So I think it is very political. Their intentions are political, but at the same time, because in the moment you liberate the self, I think the personal becomes political, because it's a political statement you're making, but you're using your own self for this. So yes.
This is, and I'm not sure whether you'll be able to answer this. I don't know. Are there any modern equivalents to Jena?
I don't know.
Think of one.
I don't know. I mean, I think there are always these times in history where it's almost like a magnified moment where groups come together. I mean, I suppose some people would argue like Silicon Valley is like this. I mean, I don't mean that it doesn't have, because it doesn't have to be positive or negative, or, but you have a kind of cluster of ingenious thinkers who kind of, rewired our brain essentially. So it doesn't, it doesn't always have to be
possible. Yes, but in terms of a cluster of people, that's, yes, that would work.
Also, I think it's often also that we only realize this in hindsight. So
yes,
if it is happening right now, we might only realize it in 20 or 30 or 50 years, maybe.
And would something like the Jena set today be shut down by cancel culture, is another question.
It's a good question, but I find it always very difficult to use the parameters of our time in history. I find it very difficult. I always had that with Alexander von Humboldt, when people would say, like, what would he say about climate change today? I don't know. I really don't know what would happen today with a group like this. I think the way they acted and they were together wouldn't actually happen today.
Another question: what did the church think of them? Were they religious in any way?
Well, that's a very interesting question. So I don't know of anything that the church complained about them. I don't think they thought, it was important enough there and then, because their importance kind of really became bigger and bigger later on. But what is interesting is that during this time, they were trying to create a new religion. And it was a religion that, because they basically complained that the church had stripped, basically Protestantism had stripped the religion of all kind of really spirituality and color and incense and feelings. And so Friedrich Schlegel, who was always quite, he's quite arrogant, quite, full of himself. He basically said, I want to be a new Luther or Mohammed and create, write a new Bible. But then a lot of them later on, when they're older, become quite religious and conservative. So Friedrich Schlegel, for example, towards in the middle of his life, really, when he's like in his late 30s, early 40s, he converts to Catholicism, for example. So they become much more religious later on. But the church, as far as I know, did not really complain about them, because they were just, they were these kind of rebellious young thinkers at that time. I don't think the church took them that serious.
Now, this is a question about Napoleon. I'm glad somebody's asked this, because all of these events are happening against the sort of, distant drumbeat of the Napoleonic Wars. The question is, given the fascination the Jena Romantics had with the French Revolution, was it ironic or indeed appropriate that Jena was subsequently the site of Napoleon's defeat of Prussia?
That's a great question. So let me just explain this a little bit. The end of the Jena set, really, and the end of Jena's reign is the Battle of Jena in 1806, when Napoleon descends with his 150,000 soldiers on this tiny little town, and he destroys the almighty Prussian army. And when the French leave, the little town is completely devastated. So you have houses burned, food, the houses are looted, corpses are rotting in the street, there's no food and drink left. I mean, the student numbers drop from almost 900 to under 200. So it's really the end of Jena. And the interesting thing is that despite Napoleon's destructive force, let's say it like this, as he's marching through the German states, a lot of Germans actually welcome him, because he's the, well, for the Jena set, he's really the romantic ideal of a genius, because he's kind of propelled by his own talents, and he embodied this kind of force of nature. But for a lot of Germans, they actually wanted the French to win, because that would have meant living in a republic rather than, ruled by a duke or a monarch or something like that. So it's this kind of very divided feeling they have. So when Napoleon arrives in Jena, although it threatens people, kind of, they might die, they still, Hegel, for example, calls him the world soul when he sees him riding through Jena. Although he might, be killed, it's still this embodiment of a better society.
Here's a good question. How did they all get the money to do all of this? How did they earn their living? And there's quite a lot about this in the book, I should say. It's a lot about money.
That's a good question. So they struggled with money all the time. So the Schlegels never really had much money. So Caroline, for example, at her dinner parties, she serves gherkins, potatoes, and herrings, and kind of like a tasteless soup. And a visitor says, the food, it's not the food, it's the intellectual menu that she prepares. Friedrich Schlegel, the younger brother, he really does not want to work at all. So he is constantly asking people for money, and running away from his from his dad. But August Wilhelm Schlegel gets paid quite well for his reviews. So although they don't have a lot of money, but it's through writing. So they write for literary magazines, for example. They don't earn a lot of money with their books. Novalis, the poet Novalis, is really the only one who has a proper job. He's a mining inspector. So although he is an aristocrat, his family, doesn't have a lot of money. So he works in the family mines with his father. So Goethe is the one who really has a lot of money. He came from a wealthy merchant family, and he is the best paid poet and he has all these jobs, doesn't he? Sort of public service jobs, working for the Duke, and exactly designing stuff for him, and and then some of them have jobs at the university, so they get paid, and they get paid by the number of their students, because the students pay them directly. So both Fichte and Schelling earn quite okay, because they have huge, they have like 400 students. Half the students of Jena go to their lectures, so they earn all right. Friedrich Schiller is always struggling with money, although he's a very famous playwright. He's never earning quite enough, because he lives in a big house, and so money is always on their mind. Somebody's asked about the role of Alexander von Humboldt within the Jena set, Humboldt obviously being the subject of your last book. How did he fit into all of this? So Alexander von Humboldt arrived in Jena because his brother Wilhelm von Humboldt was living there with his wife. So he came to visit his brother, and because Goethe was at that time so fascinated with the sciences, he just fell for Alexander von Humboldt. He said, he has woken me out of hibernation, my scientific thinking, my natural history kind of interest. And Humboldt would spend months on end in Jena. So there's one visit in 1797 where he stays for 3 months, and he sees Goethe almost every single day. So he's really encouraging Goethe to kind of work on the sciences. But I think Jena is more important for Humboldt. So because the time in Jena changes Alexander von Humboldt from being an Enlightenment scientist who believes in, experiments and rational thought and observation, and turns him into the man, the scientist he became later, someone who says we need to measure nature and we need to understand it and observe it, but we also always have to use our imagination to truly understand it. And he says that this comes from his time in Jena, because that time had given him new organs to see the world. And it's with those new organs that he then travels to South America. So he sees this new world through the lens of what he has learned in Jena. And Goethe is very, very important there, because Goethe is the one who says, you need to use your subjective feeling also to understand the scientific world. So for Humboldt, it is incredibly important what's happening in Jena. And he comes up with this idea that everything's an interconnected organism as he's traveling through South America, which I think is partly due to meeting the indigenous people there. But at the same time, so when he returns in 1799, that's the moment when Schelling develops his philosophy of oneness. So Humboldt's ideas are kind of partly from his expeditions, and then partly the philosophical foundation is found in Schelling's early philosophy.
Okay, final question, because we're running out of time. But did the duchy authorities and church have much influence on their thought and escapades? And then there is a particular incident that you relate in the book where they went a little bit too far, even for this very liberal duchy.
So it is. So just to underline, it is liberal there, and they and the censorship is, not very much enforced at all. So they can really pretty much teach and do whatever they want. But then there's a particular moment when Fichte writes a pamphlet in which he describes that God is really only a kind of moral entity, and the church people in neighboring Saxony get very upset about that. But the ruler there is a relative to the ruler of the duchy in Saxe-Weimar, and says, like, well, you need to do something about this kind of outrageous philosopher. And the Duke uses it really to get rid of Fichte, because Fichte is just a little bit too revolutionary in his political views. So he's telling his students, like, in 30 years, there won't be any kings and queens anymore. So the Duke kind of goes like, okay, this is like going a little bit too far. So there's a kind of terrible moment when Fichte kind of, says like, well, I'm going to have to resign if this and this happens. And they say like, fine. So then he has, he's basically been handed his notice and he leaves. So he leaves Jena in 1799 because of that. But most of the time, they can actually pretty much say and write what they want. They just have to be sometimes, it can't be. I mean, they write fragments. They're almost like little aphorisms in their literary magazine. And Friedrich Schlegel says at some stage, these are great because they write hundreds of them. And he says, within the hundreds, we can hide once in a while a kind of really revolutionary one, because the police will not look at these kind of philosophical fragments. So it's a kind of way of, smuggling something in there, I think.
Andrea Wulf, thank you so much for having written this marvelous book, which I have loved reading, and for a fascinating conversation. And then thanks to the audience for your great questions. I'm going to pass back to Rosie.
Thank you both so much. That was just simply wonderful. And I love the idea of smuggling those small ideas in, which is, I suppose, what everybody does all the time now, is smuggle in an idea. Andrea, congratulations on the book. And Kirsty, thank you so much for a great conversation. I hope you'll all buy it. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon. We've got lots of 5x15s coming up in September. And so all I can say is thank you very, very much indeed. That was absolutely fabulous. And good night.
Thank you.